August 11th, 480 BC, the hot gates, northern Greece. The smell hit first, salt from the Malian Gulf mixing with pine resin from the cliffs above. Then the sound, waves crashing against black rocks, methodical as a heartbeat. And finally, the heat, the kind that made bronze armor feel like it was melting into your skin. 300 Spartan warriors stood in a passage barely 50 feet wide. Behind them, the future of Western civilization. Ahead, the largest army the world had ever seen. From the journal of Aristodemus, Spartan hoplite, we were told to bring our shields back or be carried upon them. I looked at the cliffs, at the sea, at my brothers. There was no going back. There never had been. This is the story of how 300 men stopped an empire, not because they were superhuman, not because they were invincible, but because they understood something their enemy never would. Sometimes, the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything. But before we understand their sacrifice, we need to understand what they were facing. 6 months earlier, Sardis, capital of the Persian Empire's western territories. Xerxes I, King of Kings, Lord of Babylon, Pharaoh of Egypt, stood before a map that stretched from India to the Mediterranean. He was 35 years old. He commanded an empire of 50 million souls, and he had a problem that wouldn't go away: Greece. 10 years before, his father Darius had sent an army to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion. The Greeks, outnumbered, outmatched, had done the impossible at Marathon. They'd crushed the Persian invasion force, made the empire look weak. Xerxes wouldn't make the same mistake. For 4 years he'd been preparing, not an expedition, an apocalypse. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Ancient sources vary, but modern historians estimate Xerxes assembled between 150,000 and 300,000 fighting men. Infantry from Persia, cavalry from Media, archers from Bactria, chariots from India, a fleet of over 600 warships, supply trains that stretched for miles. To cross from Asia into Europe, Xerxes ordered engineers to build a bridge across the Hellespont, the strait we now call the Dardanelles. Not a small pontoon bridge, a double bridge, wide enough for 2 war chariots to pass side by side, constructed from 674 ships lashed together with flax and papyrus cables. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes had the engineers beheaded. Then he ordered his soldiers to whip the sea itself, 300 lashes, for defying him. The second bridge held. In the spring of 480 BC, the Persian army began its march. Greek spies watching from the hills reported something that seemed impossible. The column took 7 days and 7 nights to cross. When the army stopped to drink from rivers, the rivers ran dry. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a statement. We are inevitable. We are legion. Resistance is suicide. And in Sparta, a 40-year-old king named Leonidas heard the reports and began sharpening his spear. Leonidas wasn't supposed to be king. He was a younger son, 3rd in line for the throne. His name meant lion-like, but he'd spent most of his life expecting to die as a warrior, not rule as a king. Then both his older brothers died, one assassinated, one without an heir, and suddenly the crown fell to him. He'd been king for 10 years, long enough to know that Sparta's greatest weapon wasn't its spears or its shields, it was its reputation. Every Spartan boy entered military training at age 7. For 13 years, they endured hunger, cold, beatings, and combat drills designed to make death seem preferable to failure. They learned to read, but only enough to understand orders. They learned to write, but only enough to compose epitaphs. Everything else was war. At 20, if they survived, they became full citizens, Spartiate equals. They were given a plot of land worked by helots, state-owned slaves, and told their only job was to train for battle. No trade, no commerce, no softness. By the time a Spartan warrior reached 30, he'd spent 23 years learning how to kill and how to die well. The Spartans didn't have the biggest army in Greece. Athens had more men, Thebes had more cavalry, but no one had warriors like Sparta's. They were a weapon forged over generations, and in August of 480 BC, Xerxes was about to test its edge. The news reached Sparta during the Karnaia festival, a religious celebration that forbade warfare. The Persian army had crossed into Greece. City-states were surrendering without a fight. Athens had sent desperate pleas for help. The Spartan council faced an impossible choice. Send the army and violate sacred law, or obey the gods and let Greece burn. Leonidas proposed a compromise. He would take his personal guard, 300 warriors, all fathers of living sons, so their bloodlines wouldn't die with them, and march north immediately. The rest of Sparta's army would follow after the festival ended. It was technically not a military campaign, just a king and his bodyguard, traveling to a religious site. The council agreed. They knew what it really meant. They were sending 300 men to buy time with their lives. Leonidas chose his warriors carefully, not the youngest, not the strongest, but men with sons, men with something to die for, men who understood that this march north wasn't about glory. It was about making sure their children inherited a world where small nations could still say no to empires. From a letter believed to be from Leonidas to his wife Gorgo, "If I do not return, know that I fell doing what the gods made Spartans to do. Teach our son that fear is not the absence of terror, but the choice to stand despite it." They marched in late August, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, a few hundred more from smaller cities. Against Xerxes' hundreds of thousands, it was a joke, a gesture, a declaration that some men would rather die free than live kneeling. But Leonidas wasn't marching to fight a battle. He was marching to pick a battlefield, and he knew exactly where to find it. The pass at Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, was one of the few places where Greece's geography worked in its favor. A narrow coastal passage, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. At its narrowest point, the pass was barely wide enough for a single wagon. If you wanted to invade Greece from the north by land, you had two choices: take the long route through the mountains, losing weeks and wagons, or push through Thermopylae. Xerxes needed Thermopylae, and Leonidas knew it. The Spartans arrived on August 10th. The pass was everything Leonidas had hoped for. Cliffs too steep to climb on the left, the sea on the right, and in the middle, a gateway barely 50 feet wide. 300 Spartans with locked shields could hold that space. Not forever, but long enough. The locals told Leonidas about a mountain path, the Anapeia Trail, that wound through the hills and came out behind the pass. It was narrow, treacherous, barely used, but if the Persians found it, they could flank the Greek position and turn a stronghold into a tomb. Leonidas posted 1,000 Phocian soldiers to guard the trail. Then he ordered his Spartans to build a wall across the narrowest part of the pass. Not a fortress, just a knee-high barrier of stones, something to trip the first wave. When Xerxes' scouts reported the Greek position, the King of Kings laughed. Intelligence said there were maybe 7,000 Greeks total. His army outnumbered them 50 to 1, maybe 100 to 1. He sent a herald with an offer: "Surrender your weapons, and you may leave with your lives." Leonidas sent back 2 words in Greek: "Molon lab," come and take them. The Persians waited 4 days, not out of mercy, out of shock. Xerxes couldn't believe these men were serious. Scouts reported that the Spartans were exercising, combing their hair, performing religious rituals. They weren't preparing to retreat, they were preparing to die well. On the 5th day, Xerxes lost patience. He sent in the Medes, warriors from what is now northwestern Iran. Tough, experienced soldiers. 10,000 of them, more than the entire Greek force. They marched up the pass in formation, confident, disciplined. They'd conquered half of Asia. A handful of Greeks in a ditch wouldn't even slow them down. They were wrong. The Spartans let them come. Shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears leveled. The phalanx formation, 8 men deep, each warrior's shield protecting the man to his left. In the narrow pass, the Persians couldn't flank it, couldn't surround it, couldn't use their numbers. They had to go through it. The first line of Medes hit the Spartan shields like water hitting a cliff. Spears punched through leather armor. Bronze-rimmed shields shattered Persian wicker defenses. In a space where only a dozen men could fight at once, Spartan training became an execution machine. When a Spartan in the front rank fell, the man behind him stepped forward. No hesitation, no gap in the line. The phalanx was a single organism. Individual warriors were just cells. The Medes pushed for hours. They brought fresh troops, they brought archers, they brought everything they had. And the Spartans stood, bled, killed, and stood some more. By sunset, the pass was carpeted with Persian dead. The Medes retreated in disorder. They'd lost thousands. The Greeks had lost fewer than 100. Xerxes watched from a hilltop throne and reportedly leapt to his feet 3 times in horror. These weren't soldiers. They were something he'd never encountered before. Men who fought like death itself didn't scare them, because it didn't. From Aristodemos's journal, that first night, we ate barley bread and drank wine mixed with seawater. Someone asked if we thought we'd won. Leonidas said we hadn't won anything. We'd bought one day. Tomorrow we'd buy another. That was the job, not victory, time. And this is probably a good moment to mention something important. If you're fascinated by stories like this, stories where the stakes are impossible and the courage is real, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We dive deep into history's most crucial moments, the battles that changed everything, and the people who refused to back down even when every rational voice told them to run. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is just getting started. And trust me, what happens next is going to redefine what you think courage means. On the second day, Xerxes sent his elite troops, the Immortals, 10,000 of the Persian Empire's finest warriors, so named because their ranks were kept at exactly 10,000. Whenever one fell, another immediately took his place. They wore scale armor, carried short spears and bows, and had never tasted defeat. They marched up the pass in perfect formation. Drummers kept the rhythm. Officers shouted commands. They were going to sweep these Greeks aside and restore Persian honor. The Spartans changed tactics. Instead of holding a static line, they used the phalanx's mobility. They'd engage, fight for a few minutes, then retreat in formation, luring the Immortals forward, making them think the Greeks were breaking. Then the Spartans would spin, reform, and drive forward with spears leveled. The Persians, caught in mid-pursuit, disorganized, would slam into a wall of bronze and iron. Dozens would fall in seconds. The Spartans repeated this maneuver all day. Advance, retreat, spin, kill. The Immortals, trained to fight in open plains with room to maneuver, couldn't adapt. The narrow pass negated every advantage they had. By the second sunset, the Immortals had lost hundreds. They limped back to camp, defeated by an enemy a tenth their size. Xerxes held a council of war. His generals were blunt. They couldn't break through. The pass was a killing floor. As long as the Greeks held it, the army was stuck. The fleet couldn't land troops behind them. Greek warships controlled the coastal waters. The mountain route was supposed to be impassable. They were the largest army in the world, and they were being stopped by 300 men in a ditch. Then a local Greek arrived at the Persian camp. His name was Ephialtes, and he had information to sell. He knew about the Anopeia trail. He could guide the Persians through the mountains, around the pass, behind the Spartan line. For gold, he'd make Leonidas's fortress into a trap. Xerxes listened, smiled, and sent 20,000 men into the hills that night, with Ephialtes leading the way. The Phocian guards posted on the mountain trail heard the Persians coming around midnight. Footsteps, thousands of them, rustling through the oak leaves that carpeted the path. They formed ranks, ready to fight. But the Persians didn't attack. They just marched past in the darkness, heading for the pass's rear exit. The Phocians sent runners to warn Leonidas, but they knew it was too late. By dawn, the Spartans would be surrounded. Leonidas received the news just before sunrise. Scouts confirmed it. Persian forces were hours away from cutting off the retreat. The trap was closing. He called a council. The allied Greeks wanted to retreat immediately. There was still time. They could fall back, regroup, fight another day. Leonidas refused. If the entire Greek force retreated, the Persians would pursue. They'd catch the slow-moving column on the road and slaughter them in the open. But if someone held the pass, bought time for the retreat, most of the army could escape. The Spartans would stay. The 300 would become the price for 7,000 lives. He dismissed the allies, ordered them to march south immediately. Most obeyed. The Thespians, 700 of them, refused to leave. They'd fought beside the Spartans for 3 days. They'd die beside them too. The Thebans, 400 strong, also remained, though some historians suggest they stayed as hostages, ensuring their city wouldn't fully betray Greece. So on the morning of the 3rd day, as the sun rose over the Malian Gulf, roughly 1,100 men stood in the pass. Behind them, the Persian army. Ahead of them, more Persians. Above them, the mountain trail that had betrayed them. They were surrounded, outnumbered, already dead. And they dressed for battle like they were going to a wedding. From Herodotus, the Greek historian, the Spartans combed their long hair, as was their custom before facing death. When the Persians saw this, they were confused. They did not understand that these men were preparing to kill and be killed beautifully. Leonidas addressed his warriors one final time. No speeches about glory, no promises of immortality, just a simple statement: breakfast here, dinner in Hades. They understood. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a sacrifice. They were buying time with their blood, and the price was every last drop. Xerxes attacked at dawn, not with a vanguard, not with a probing force, with everything. Waves of infantry, thousands deep, rolling up the pass like a human flood. The Spartans didn't wait behind their wall. They charged, out into the open, spears leveled, moving at a dead run. They hit the Persian front line like a bronze avalanche. For hours they fought in the open. No formations, no tactics, just Spartans with broken spears using swords, then swords breaking and using hands, teeth, anything to take one more Persian with them. Leonidas fell in the first hour. 4 times the Spartans rallied and retook his body. The king of Sparta would not be a trophy. Finally, they dragged him back to a small hillock in the center of the pass and formed a circle around him. By midday, the Persians encircling them from behind had reached the battle. The Spartans and Thespians were surrounded completely. Spears gone, swords shattered, shields split. They fought with their hands. The Persians stopped trying to fight them hand to hand. Too many had died getting close. Instead, they formed ranks at a distance and used arrows, thousands of arrows, a black cloud that blotted out the sun. There's a famous exchange recorded before the battle. A Persian envoy warned the Spartans that Persian arrows were so numerous they would block out the sun. A Spartan warrior named Dionysus replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." Now, in the final minutes, that prophecy came true. The sky went dark, and the last of the 300 died on their feet, shields raised, facing the enemy. When the arrows finally stopped, Persian soldiers crept forward cautiously. They found bodies stacked in a circle, everyone facing outward. In the center, Leonidas, covered by the shields of his men even in death. Xerxes ordered the king's head cut off and placed on a pike. It was the only time in recorded Persian history that they mutilated an enemy's corpse. Leonidas had made the King of Kings afraid. But the story doesn't end in that blood-soaked pass. Because while 300 Spartans were dying, 7,000 Greeks were escaping south. And those 7,000 would fight at Salamis, at Plataea, in the battles that would eventually break the Persian invasion and save Western civilization. Thermopylae wasn't a victory, it was a choice. 300 men chose to die so that millions could live free. The pass of Thermopylae today is quiet. The sea has receded over 2,000 years, and the narrow coastal passage is now farmland and highway. But there's a stone monument there, a statue of Leonidas, and beneath it an epitaph written by the poet Simonides, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." They didn't disobey. They didn't retreat. They didn't beg. They just stood. And in standing, they changed the world. August 20th, 480 BC. Athens. The runner collapsed in the agora, the city's central marketplace. He'd covered 140 miles in 3 days. His feet were bleeding through his sandals. His lips were cracked from dehydration, but he delivered his message before he let anyone give him water. Thermopylae has fallen. Leonidas is dead. The Persians are coming. The marketplace went silent. Then someone screamed. Then everyone was screaming. Athens had maybe 48 hours before Xerxes' army reached the city walls. 48 hours to decide whether to fight, flee, or surrender. 48 hours to figure out if 300 Spartans had died for nothing. The man who would answer that question wasn't a king. He was a politician named Themistocles, and he'd been planning for this moment for 10 years. After Marathon, the battle where Greece had defeated Persia's first invasion, most Athenians wanted to celebrate and forget. Themistocles wanted to build ships. He'd argued that Persia would return with a bigger army, and Greece's only hope was to control the sea. He'd been right. By the summer of 480 BC, Athens had 300 warships. Triremes, sleek, fast galleys powered by 170 oarsmen and tipped with bronze rams designed to punch through enemy hulls. The largest navy in Greece. And now Themistocles was betting everything on a single idea: abandon Athens, evacuate the entire population to the island of Salamis, and force the Persian fleet into a trap. It was insane. Athens was the cradle of democracy, the home of philosophy, the jewel of Greek culture. Walking away meant letting the Persians burn it all. But Themistocles understood what Leonidas had understood. You don't win by protecting what you love. You win by making sure it survives. The evacuation began immediately. Women, children, elderly, loaded onto every boat that could float. Ferried to Salamis, to Aegina, to Trozen, the city's treasury melted down, the sacred statues wrapped and hidden. Everything that couldn't be carried, left behind. By September, Athens was a ghost town. Empty streets, open doors, altars cold. And then the Persians arrived. Xerxes entered Athens on September 21st. There was no battle, no resistance, just an empty city and one small group of defenders barricaded on the Acropolis, the sacred hill where the Parthenon would one day stand. They held for 2 weeks. Then the Persians scaled the cliffs, stormed the defenses, and slaughtered every Greek they found. They burned the temples, smashed the statues, turned Athens into a message written in ash and blood. This is what happens when you defy Persia. But from the island of Salamis, 2 miles across the water, Themistocles watched the smoke rise and smiled, because Xerxes had just made a mistake. The Persian fleet, over 600 ships, had followed the army down the coast. They'd taken losses in a storm off Euboea, more losses in a skirmish at Artemisium, but they still outnumbered the Greek fleet 2-1. Xerxes wanted a decisive naval battle. He needed to crush the Greek fleet so his army could march south without worrying about supply lines. And the Greeks were trapped in the Saronic Gulf, hemmed in by islands. It looked like checkmate. Themistocles saw it differently. The Saronic Gulf was narrow. The straits between Salamis and the mainland were even narrower, barely 3/4 of a mile wide in places. If he could lure the Persian fleet into those tight waters, their numbers would become a liability. Ships would collide, formations would break, Chaos would replace discipline, and in chaos, Greek triremes, smaller, faster, crewed by men fighting for their families visible on the shore, would have the advantage. But the other Greek commanders didn't trust Themistocles. Sparta wanted to retreat to the Peloponnese and build a wall across the isthmus of Corinth. Corinth wanted to protect its own territory. Nobody wanted to risk everything on one battle in a narrow strait. They held a council on the evening of September 27th. Themistocles argued for hours, begged, threatened. Finally, he played his last card. If the fleet retreated, Athens would take its 300 ships and sail west to Italy. They'd abandon Greece entirely. It was a bluff, but it worked. The council voted to stay and fight. Then Themistocles did something extraordinary. He sent a trusted slave, a man named Sisinus, to the Persian camp with a message for Xerxes. The message claimed that Themistocles was secretly a Persian sympathizer, that the Greek fleet was planning to retreat during the night, that if Xerxes blocked the exits from the Gulf now, he could trap them all and destroy them at dawn. It was a lie. But Xerxes believed it. He ordered his fleet to move into position under cover of darkness. Egyptian ships blocked the western exit. Persian and Phoenician ships filled the eastern strait. By sunrise, the Greek fleet would be surrounded. It would be marathon in reverse, a humiliation that would echo through history, except the Greeks weren't retreating. They were waiting. September 28th, 480 BC. The Strait of Salamis. The Persian fleet entered the strait at dawn. Ship after ship, hundreds of them, oars beating in unison. They expected to find the Greeks scattered, panicked, trying to escape. Instead, they found them formed in a crescent, facing the narrows, waiting. And then the Greeks sang. It's recorded by Aeschylus, who fought in the battle. Forward, sons of Greece, free your fatherland, free your children, your wives, the temples of your fathers' gods, the tombs of your ancestors. Now the fight is for everything. The paean, the ancient Greek war hymn, echoed off the cliffs. 200 Greek ships, tens of thousands of voices singing as one. Not a cry of rage, a statement of purpose. Then they attacked. The Greeks surged forward. The Persian vanguard, crowded in the narrow waters, couldn't maneuver, couldn't form proper battle lines. Ships collided with each other trying to engage. The Greek triremes, built for ramming, drove their bronze beaks into Persian hulls. Wood splintered, ships listed. Men in armor fell into the water and drowned. The Persians tried to press their numerical advantage. More ships pushed into the strait, but that just made it worse. Now there were too many ships in too small a space. Oars tangled, hulls scraped together. Commands couldn't be heard over the chaos. The Greeks, fighting in waters they knew, exploited every advantage. They'd let a Persian ship chase them toward shallow water. At the last second, the Greek trireme would pivot. Oarsmen on one side backing water while the other side pulled forward, spinning the ship like a dancer. The Persian ship, heavier and less maneuverable, would run aground. Greek marines would swarm aboard and slaughter the crew. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on a hill overlooking the strait. His secretaries sat beside him, recording which captains fought bravely and which ones showed cowardice. They were supposed to be recording a victory. Instead, they documented a massacre. By midday, the Persian fleet was in full retreat. They'd lost over 200 ships. Thousands of sailors and marines drowned or burned. The survivors fled north in disorder, abandoning any pretense of protecting the army's supply lines. The Greeks had lost about 40 ships. They'd won the most decisive naval victory in ancient history, and they'd done it because 300 Spartans had given them the time to get into position. Here's what Thermopylae actually accomplished. When Leonidas made his stand, he bought 7 days. 7 days for Athens to evacuate. 7 days for the Greek fleet to regroup at Artemisium. 7 days for Themistocles to finalize his plan. Without those 7 days, there's no evacuation. Without the evacuation, Themistocles can't use Athens' population as bait to force the fleet to stay and fight. Without the fight at Salamis, Persia controls the sea. Without the sea, Greece falls. Leonidas didn't stop Xerxes at Thermopylae. He stopped him at Salamis. He just didn't live to see it. After Salamis, Xerxes faced an impossible situation. His fleet was crippled. His supply lines were vulnerable. Winter was coming. And the Greek army, no longer divided and panicked, was regrouping south of Athens. He made the only logical choice. He took the bulk of his army and marched back to Persia. Left behind a garrison force under his general Mardonius, still over 100,000 men, with orders to finish the conquest in the spring. It was a strategic retreat dressed up as a confidence move, but everyone knew the truth. The largest empire in the world had been fought to a standstill by a collection of city-states that spent half their time fighting each other. The psychological impact was catastrophic for Persia. Cities that had surrendered started to reconsider. Allies began to waver. The aura of invincibility, the thing that made empires function, cracked. And in Sparta, when the news of Salamis arrived, they held a ceremony for the 300, not a funeral. Spartans didn't mourn warriors who died in battle. They celebrated them. They sang the names, carved them in stone, made sure that every Spartan child for generations would know what their sacrifice had purchased. There's a fragment from a Spartan poet, roughly translated, "They died, but they are not dead. They live in the choice we make each day to stand." But the war wasn't over. Mardonius spent the winter of 480–479 BC trying to rebuild Persian credibility. He sent envoys to Athens offering peace, autonomy, wealth. All Athens had to do was abandon the alliance and accept Persian overlordship. Themistocles refused. So Mardonius marched on Athens again. The Athenians evacuated again, and the Persians burned what was left of the city again. By the summer of 479 BC, the Athenian people were refugees twice over, living on Salamis, watching their city burn a second time, wondering if they'd made the right choice. The Spartans, finally done with their religious festivals, mobilized the full army, 5,000 Spartiates, 35,000 Helot infantry, allied forces from across the Peloponnese. They marched north under the command of Pausanias, Leonidas' nephew and regent for his young son. The two armies met at Plataea, a small town in Boeotia, on August 27, 479 BC, exactly 1 year and 6 days after Thermopylae. Mardonius had chosen his ground carefully, an open plain where his cavalry could operate, high ground for his infantry. He had numbers, he had position, he had confidence. What he didn't have was an understanding of what Thermopylae had done to Greek psychology. The Battle of Plataea lasted 2 weeks. Not continuous fighting, ancient battles rarely were, but 2 weeks of maneuvering, skirmishing, trying to force the other side into a mistake. Mardonius struck first. His cavalry harassed the Greek supply lines, poisoned their water sources, killed scouts and stragglers. He was trying to force the Greeks to either retreat or attack uphill. The Greeks, spread out over miles of rough terrain, struggled to maintain cohesion. Different contingents wanted different strategies. Athens and Sparta, traditional rivals, nearly came to blows over who should hold which position. But Pausanias held the alliance together. He repositioned his forces under cover of night, a dangerous maneuver that could have turned into a rout. Instead, it drew Mardonius into attacking a retreating enemy. The Persians charged at dawn on September 13th. Cavalry, infantry, everything Mardonius had. They hit the Spartan right wing first. The Spartans, 9 ranks deep, locked shields and took the impact. Then they started pushing. The Persian infantry, brave, skilled veterans of a dozen campaigns, couldn't understand what they were facing. These weren't soldiers. They were a machine. Every push forward, the Spartans pushed back harder. Every attempt to flank, the formation adjusted. And then the Spartans countercharged. Pausanias led from the front. The Spartan phalanx rolled forward like bronze avalanche. They punched through the Persian center, shattered the line, sent Mardonius' elite troops fleeing. Mardonius himself, riding a white horse, tried to rally his men. A Spartan named Iamnestus threw a rock, not a spear, a rock, and struck Mardonius in the head. The Persian general fell from his horse and died in the dust. Without Mardonius, the Persian army collapsed. They fled to their fortified camp. The Greeks followed. They stormed the wooden walls, burned the tents, slaughtered soldiers and camp followers alike. By sunset, Persian power in Greece was annihilated. Of Mardonius' 100,000-man army, only a small fraction escaped back to Asia. The Greeks had won, completely, decisively, permanently. And every Greek warrior knew that the victory started at Thermopylae. That if 300 Spartans hadn't stood when standing was suicide, none of them would be alive to fight at Plataea. In the aftermath, the Greeks did something unusual. They collected the spoils of war, armor, weapons, gold, and melted down a portion to create a monument. Not a statue of a god, a monument to a man, Leonidas. It stood at the entrance to Thermopylae, bronze, 7 feet tall, holding a spear. The inscription read, "This monument is to Leonidas, king of Sparta, who with 300 Spartiates and 700 Thespians stood here against 300 myriads of the enemy." 300 myriads, 3 million. The number was propaganda. Ancient historians loved to exaggerate enemy numbers, but the sentiment was real. A handful of men had fought the world and forced it to blink, but the story that echoed through history wasn't about the numbers, it was about the choice. Aristodemos, the Spartan warrior whose journal we've been quoting, survived Thermopylae. He'd been sent away before the final battle with an eye infection. He returned to Sparta, expecting to be welcomed as a survivor. Instead, he was shunned, labeled a coward. No one would speak to him. No one would let him into their homes. Spartans had a word for men who valued survival over honor: Trisantes, the tremblers. Aristodemos spent a year as a living ghost. Then, at Plataea, he broke ranks, charged alone into the Persian lines, fought like a madman, killed dozens before he was cut down. He died trying to prove he wasn't a coward, and Sparta still refused to honor him. The official record says he died seeking death to erase his shame, not seeking glory to defend his brothers. That was the Spartan standard. Death wasn't enough. You had to die the right way, for the right reasons. It's brutal by any modern standard, but it's also why Thermopylae mattered. The Spartans weren't just willing to die. They'd built an entire culture around dying well. And when Xerxes encountered that culture in a narrow pass, he discovered that all the soldiers and gold in the world couldn't break it. There's a moment recorded by Herodotus that captures this perfectly. Before the battle, a Persian officer visited the Greek camp and reported back to Xerxes. He said the Spartans were combing their hair and exercising. He thought they were insane. Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king advising Xerxes, explained, "These men have come to fight us for the pass, and it is for that they are preparing. It is their custom to adorn their heads when they are about to put their lives in hazard." Xerxes still didn't understand. How could hair matter when you're about to die? That's the point. It wasn't about the hair, it was about the message. We're not afraid, we're not desperate. We're doing what we were born to do, and we're going to look magnificent doing it. The Persians fought for an empire. The Greeks fought for a way of life. And when those two forces collided, the empire blinked first. After Plataea, Persia never seriously threatened Greece again. There would be more conflicts. The Greco-Persian wars dragged on for decades, but the existential threat was over. Western civilization, whatever you think of it, survived. Democracy survived. Philosophy survived. Theater survived. Science survived. Not because they were destined to, but because enough men chose to stand in enough narrow places and refuse to move. Thermopylae became the template, a blueprint for how small groups with strong convictions can resist overwhelming force. It's been referenced in every major conflict since. The Alamo, the Battle of Thermopylae, the defenders of Bastonia, every hopeless stand where men decide that some things are worth dying for. The Spartans themselves never reached those heights again. Their culture, so effective at producing warriors, was terrible at producing anything else. No art, no literature, no innovation. Within a century, they'd become a curiosity, a living museum of military discipline in a world that had moved on. But Thermopylae echoed, and still echoes, because the question it asks is timeless. What are you willing to die for? And if the answer is nothing, what are you really living for? Leonidas answered with 300 men and 7 days. Themistocles answered with Athens in ashes and a fleet in the straits. Pausanias answered with 10,000 Spartans marching north to finish what their king started. And Xerxes, king of kings, lord of Babylon, pharaoh of Egypt, went home and spent the rest of his life trying to forget a narrow pass where 300 men made him look mortal. He never did. In 465 BC, Xerxes was assassinated by his own bodyguard. The Persian Empire, overextended and undermined by the defeats in Greece, began its long decline. Within 2 centuries, it would fall to Alexander the Great, a Macedonian king who'd studied the Battle of Thermopylae and learned its lesson. Empires can be beaten, not with more soldiers, but with more courage. 331 BC, the Granicus River, Asia Minor. Alexander the Great stood before his army on the eve of battle, 22 years old, king of Macedon for 2 years, about to invade the Persian Empire with 40,000 men against a kingdom of millions. His generals were terrified. The Persians held the far bank of the river. Cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center. It was a killing ground. A rational commander would wait. Find better terrain. Avoid unnecessary risk. Alexander gave a different order. He pointed across the river and said 5 words. Remember what the Spartans did. Then he spurred his horse into the water and charged. His army followed. They crossed under a hail of arrows, fought uphill against cavalry, won a battle they had no logical right to win, and began the conquest that would end the Persian Empire forever. Alexander carried a copy of Homer's Iliad with him everywhere. But he studied something else just as carefully. The campaigns of the Greco-Persian Wars, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, the template for how a small, disciplined force could break an empire's will. He didn't just learn tactics, he learned psychology, that empires are fragile things, that they rely on the belief in their own invincibility, and that once that belief shatters, the whole structure collapses. Leonidas shattered that belief in a pass 50 feet wide. Alexander built a career on the rubble. But Alexander's empire died with him, carved up by his generals, forgotten within generations. The Persian Empire fell, the Roman Empire fell. Every great power that seemed eternal in its moment eventually crumbled into dust and archaeology. Thermopylae didn't fall, it grew. Not the battle, the idea, the story, the choice to stand when standing seems insane. Let's talk about why that matters. Because this isn't just ancient history. It's a case study in how small groups change the world, and the lessons from that narrow pass in 480 BC are still being used today. First lesson, terrain matters more than numbers. Leonidas didn't try to fight Xerxes in the open. He picked a battlefield where Persian advantages became liabilities. 300 Spartans in the pass were worth 30,000 in the field. Modern asymmetric warfare uses the same principle. You don't fight where your enemy is strong. You fight where geography, technology, or psychology gives you leverage. Guerrilla movements from Vietnam to Afghanistan have studied Thermopylae not for inspiration, but for tactics. Second lesson, morale is a weapon. The Spartans didn't kill enough Persians to matter strategically. Xerxes could replace his losses 10 times over, but what the Spartans did was prove that Persians could bleed, could panic, could run, that psychological damage spread. Every Greek city that was considering surrender saw what happened at Thermopylae and reconsidered. Every Persian soldier marching south knew that just ahead were men who'd made the invincible immortals look mortal. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. Third lesson, sacrifice needs witnesses. If the 300 had died and nobody knew about it, the stand would have been meaningless. But Greek runners carried the story to every city-state. Poets immortalized it. Historians documented it. The sacrifice became a story, and the story became a weapon. This is why authoritarian regimes spend so much effort controlling narratives. It's not enough to crush resistance. You have to erase the memory that resistance is possible. The Spartans made resistance unforgettable. But here's the darker lesson, the one that's harder to talk about. Thermopylae worked because the Spartans had built a culture where death was preferable to dishonor, where warriors combed their hair before battle because looking good mattered more than living. That culture was brutal. Infants deemed weak were left to die on a hillside. Boys were beaten, starved, and traumatized to turn them into soldiers. Women were valued primarily for producing warrior sons. The vast majority of Sparta's population were helots, slaves, whose lives meant nothing. The 300 weren't heroes because they were good people. They were effective because they'd been shaped by a society that valued martial excellence above everything else, including humanity. So when we celebrate Thermopylae, we need to ask, what are we actually celebrating? The willingness to sacrifice for a greater cause, or the system that made men view death as more honorable than life? It's possible to admire the courage without endorsing the culture, to study the tactics without romanticizing the brutality, to learn from the sacrifice without ignoring its cost, because Sparta paid a cost. That culture that produced the 300, it killed Sparta. By 371 BC, just over a century after Thermopylae, Sparta was defeated by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra. Not because Spartan warriors had gotten weaker, but because Sparta had no flexibility, no ability to adapt, no capacity to innovate. They'd built a perfect weapon for one specific purpose, and when the world changed, they couldn't change with it. The Spartans kept training boys the same way, fighting the same way, thinking the same way, while Athens developed philosophy, democracy, and theater. While other city-states built trade networks and alliances, Sparta just kept making soldiers. By the Roman era, Sparta was a tourist attraction. Wealthy Romans would visit to watch Spartan boys being flogged in religious rituals. A spectacle, not a society. The culture that produced Leonidas had become a parody of itself. But Thermopylae survived, because the story was never really about Sparta. It was about a choice that transcends culture. Do you stand or do you run? Do you fight when fighting seems pointless? Or do you calculate the odds and walk away? Do you sacrifice for something larger than yourself? Or do you prioritize your own survival above all else? Every generation faces that choice. And every generation looks back at Thermopylae for an answer. The defenders of the Alamo in 1836 knew they were dead. They could have retreated. Instead, they bought 13 days for Sam Houston to build an army. Texas independence was won at San Jacinto, but it was made possible at the Alamo. Sound familiar? The British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk in 1940 should have been annihilated. Instead, rearguard actions, soldiers fighting hopeless defensive battles to buy time, allowed over 300,000 men to evacuate. Britain stayed in the war. The path to D-Day remained open. The Marines at the Chosin Reservoir in 1950, surrounded by Chinese forces in sub-zero temperatures, fought a 17-day retreat that military historians still study. They were outnumbered 10-1. They should have surrendered. They didn't. They broke out, took their wounded with them, and preserved an entire division. These aren't just military victories. They're applications of the Thermopylae principle. Sometimes losing slowly is how you win. But it's not just military. The principle applies anywhere people face overwhelming odds. Civil rights marchers in the American South faced dogs, fire hoses, and lynch mobs. They could have stopped, stayed safe, chosen to live rather than risk death for a principle. They marched anyway. And the courage to stand when standing meant bleeding changed a nation. Protesters in Tiananmen Square faced tanks. Dissidents in Soviet gulags faced torture. Journalists in authoritarian regimes face imprisonment. They stand anyway, not because they think they'll win, but because someone has to. That's the real legacy of Thermopylae, not that 300 men died, but that they chose to die in a way that mattered. That turned death into a message. That made defeat into victory. And here's what makes it relevant today. We live in an era where standing for principle often seems pointless, where cynicism is mistaken for wisdom, where the rational choice is always to calculate the odds and optimize for personal benefit. Thermopylae says, sometimes the rational choice is the wrong choice. Sometimes you stand because standing is right, not because it's smart. Because if everyone always makes the rational choice to prioritize survival over principle, then principles die. And with them, the things that make survival worth having. The Spartans understood something we've forgotten, that societies aren't held together by laws or economies or military power. They're held together by a shared willingness to sacrifice for something bigger. When that willingness dies, everything else falls apart. Empires crumble, not when they're conquered, but when citizens stop believing anything is worth dying for. Xerxes commanded the largest army in the world, but his soldiers were there because they had to be, because they were conscripts or mercenaries or subjects with no choice. They fought, but they didn't believe. The Spartans were there because they chose to be, because dying at Thermopylae was who they were. And when those two forces collided, belief won. It always does, eventually. Let's go back to that pass one more time, not to the battle, to what happened after. In the decades following Thermopylae, Greek travelers would stop at the site. They'd pour wine on the ground, say the names, leave offerings. It became a pilgrimage site, a place where people went to remember what courage looked like. The epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws we lie," became one of the most famous sentences in human history. It's been translated into every major language, quoted in parliaments and battlefields, written on memorials from Washington, D.C. to Warsaw. Why? Because it captures something essential. The Spartans didn't die rebelling. They died obeying. They weren't martyrs fighting against their society. They were the ultimate expression of their society's values. That's a profoundly conservative idea in the philosophical sense. It says that duty matters, that laws and traditions and cultural identity are worth preserving, even at the cost of individual life. Modern Western culture struggles with that idea. We prioritize individual autonomy, personal choice, the right to define our own values rather than inherit them. But Thermopylae asks, if everyone only fights for themselves, who fights for the things that make individual freedom possible? Who maintains the system that allows you to choose? The Spartans would say, we do. And we ask nothing in return except that you remember we stood. There's a tension there that's never been resolved, between individual liberty and collective sacrifice, between personal survival and cultural continuity, between the rational choice and the right choice. Thermopylae doesn't answer that tension. It just illuminates it, shows us what's at stake when we choose one side or the other, and it asks each of us quietly what our own answer would be. If you were a Spartan warrior standing in that pass, knowing you were going to die, would you stay or would you run? Most of us honestly would run. That's not cowardice, that's biology, survival instinct, the rational choice. But societies need people who don't make the rational choice, who stand anyway. Not because they're superhuman, but because they've found something worth dying for. The question isn't whether you'd be one of the 300. The question is whether you've found your Thermopylae, the thing you'd stand for even when standing seems insane. For Leonidas, it was Sparta's laws and Greek freedom. For Themistocles, it was Athenian democracy. For Aristodemos, it was erasing the shame of survival. What's yours? Because here's the thing about Thermopylae. It's not ancient history. It's happening right now, everywhere, in small ways and large. Every time someone stands up to a bully, even though it's safer to look away. Every time a whistleblower exposes corruption, knowing their career is over. Every time a protester faces riot police, or a journalist publishes truth that puts them at risk, or a scientist defends facts against political pressure. That's Thermopylae. It's not always life and death, but it's always a choice between the safe path and the right path, between calculation and conviction, and the world changes not through the people who calculate, but through the people who choose to stand. Now, if you've made it this far through this story, you're clearly someone who values depth over superficiality, who wants to understand not just what happened, but why it matters. That's exactly the kind of audience we create content for on this channel. We dig into history's pivotal moments, explore the decisions that changed everything, and ask the hard questions about what they mean for us today. So, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Join a community of people who believe that understanding the past is how we navigate the future. Because stories like Thermopylae aren't just history. They're instruction manuals for courage, and we've got a lot more of them to explore together. The pass at Thermopylae today is unremarkable. The sea has receded, the cliffs are weathered. Cars drive past on a highway built over ancient battlefields. You can visit in an afternoon and see everything there is to see. But stand there long enough and you can feel it. The weight of what happened, the choice that was made, the price that was paid. 300 men stood in this spot and bought the world 7 days. 7 days that became 2,500 years of Western civilization. Democracy, philosophy, science, art, everything we associate with the West, flawed and complicated as it is, survived because of what happened here, not because the Spartans were perfect. They weren't. Not because their society was just. It wasn't. But because they understood that some things are worth dying for, and they were willing to pay that price. Xerxes went home and built palaces. Leonidas went into the ground and built a legend. Xerxes' palaces are ruins. Leonidas's legend is still standing. There's a modern memorial at Thermopylae now, a bronze statue of Leonidas looking south toward Sparta. His shield is raised, his spear is leveled. His expression is calm. Tourists take photos, school groups visit on field trips. Historians bring tour groups and explain the tactics and the politics and the cultural context. But sometimes, if you're there at the right time, you'll see something else. A veteran, grey-haired, standing silently. Or a young soldier in uniform, pausing on their way to somewhere else. Or just someone who came to remember what courage looks like when the odds are impossible. They don't take photos. They just stand for a moment, acknowledging something that can't quite be put into words, that here, in this place, on a hot August day in 480 BC, 300 men proved that numbers don't always win, that will can overcome force, that small groups with strong convictions can change history, not always, not easily, not without cost, but sometimes, and sometimes is enough. The epitaph carved into the memorial is simple, just 2 lines in Greek. O xein agelin lakedemonies otite dekimetha to iskinon rimas epithomeni. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. They weren't asking for pity, or praise, or even remembrance. They were stating a fact. They did what they were raised to do, what their culture demanded, what honor required. They stood, and the world bent around that choice. That's the lesson of Thermopylae. Not that sacrifice is always necessary, not that death is glorious, not that military valor is the highest virtue, but that when the moment comes, when standing seems pointless and running seems rational, and every voice of self-preservation is screaming at you to walk away, some people stand anyway, and those people change everything. Leonidas and his 300 didn't stop an empire with their spears. They stopped it with their choice, the choice to be men who couldn't be moved, who valued honor over life, who bought time with blood and made sure the price was paid in full. Xerxes built an empire on fear. The Spartans built a legacy on defiance. The empire fell. The legacy endures. So here's the question this story leaves us with, the one that's been echoing for 2,500 years, the one each generation has to answer for itself. What's your Thermopylae? What's the thing you'd stand for even when standing seems like suicide? What principle, what cause, what idea is worth more than your own survival? And if the answer is nothing, are you really living or just surviving? The Spartans would say that survival without honor is just slow death, that life is measured not in years but in choices, that immortality doesn't come from living long, but from dying well. You don't have to agree with them. Their culture was brutal. Their values were alien to modern sensibility. Their society was built on slavery and militarism and a definition of honor that excluded most of humanity. But they answered the question, fully, finally, in a way that still resonates. 300 men, 7 days, one choice, and that choice echoes still. In every hopeless fight where people stand anyway, in every impossible odd that someone decides to face, in every moment when the rational path diverges from the right path and someone chooses right. Thermopylae isn't a place, it's not even a battle, it's a test, the one each of us faces when the cost of standing becomes clear and the benefit of walking away is obvious. Do you stand or do you run? The Spartans stood, and by standing, they proved that sometimes the greatest victories come from defeats that refuse to be final. Sometimes losing on your feet is better than winning on your knees. Sometimes 300 is enough.